Hello, and welcome to our analysis of Franz Joseph Haydn's Piano Sonata number 52 in E-flat major. We're going to be taking a look at the first movement and the formal elements of how Haydn put this together, and really going to take a keen look at how he treated the recapitulation in relation to the exposition. So without any further ado, let's get right into it.
So today we're going to be reviewing Franz Joseph Haydn's final Piano Sonata number 52 in E-flat major. We're going to be taking a look at the Allegro movement, which of course is the first movement of the piece. Now, the big focus of what we're going to be exploring today is how the exposition and the recapitulation relate to each other. We'll briefly talk about the development, but we're not going to spend too much time on it. Really looking at what ways does the recapitulation match the exposition, what ways does it change the material from the exposition, and in what ways does this movement follow the expectations of sonata form of the late classical period. So we can immediately see that the Allegro movement, the first movement here, is 116 measures in length. Now the exposition is 43 measures with a repeat section at the end that takes us back to measure 1. Beyond that, we enter the development around measure 44, takes up to measure 79. Again, that won't be the scope of this discussion, but we will talk about it briefly towards the end. And the recapitulation takes us from measure 79 to the end at measure 116. So let's begin by breaking down what's going on in the exposition. So we can see here that the exposition is broken up, for the most part, into 4 sections. The first 8 measures present us the first subject, which is a theme that pops back throughout the first movement. Mostly stays in the key of E-flat major with an imperfect authentic cadence that takes us into the transitional material starting at measure 9. Now within this transition we start off with this first theme again, but it goes through a little bit of a modification and starts to lead to something a little bit interesting. By measure 17, Haydn has tonicized the dominant by coming from an F major chord into a B flat, really tonicizing B flat for measure 17, where he represents the first theme, albeit this time in the dominant. The transition section ends, I would say, at the measure 26, 27, where we go into the second subject. Again, there's a perfect authentic cadence from F to B flat, tonicized in the dominant at the beginning of measure 27 for the beginning of the second subject. Now the second subject has quite a little bit going on here. He moves to B flat minor briefly around measure 29. And we're back to the B flat major, again still sitting on the dominant, around measure 31. Again, tonicizing the B flat dominant going into measure 33 again with an imperfect authentic cadence. We hit a little bit of a closing theme here. Within the second subject, it kind of feels as if we're moving towards the ending of the exposition around measure 33. But at measure 38, we enter what I've labeled as a codetta. Now, this begins with a half note figure. Haydn again tonicizes the dominant from the F chord with the perfect authentic cadence from measures 40 to 41. And at the end of measure 43, we repeat back to the beginning to repeat the exposition, which is fairly standard and expected for a piece, especially sonata form piece, of the late classical period.
Now we're going to jump over to the recapitulation and compare it to what we just heard from the exposition. So here at the end of the development, we get a sense that Haydn's going somewhere, but it's almost crazy how he comes back into the recapitulation, back in the tonic key of E flat here at measure 79. Let's take a listen.
Perhaps the biggest difference with the restatement of the first subject from measure 79 has a little bit of a difference leading into measure 86, which has some modified material back from the bridge or transition section, similar to what we had back at measures 10 through 16.
And here we go into a little bit of a difference.
We again tonicize E flat, leading into measure 93, where he further develops that first theme. At measure 98, we have a perfect authenticateds again, tonicizing the tonic of E flat for a restatement of the second subject. Again, another cadence leads us into measure 104 for a restatement of that closing theme that we originally saw back around measure 33. And at measure 109, he enters the codetta, which is a little extended and heavily modified from the original codetta, taking us to the end of the first movement. Shortly into that codetta, again tonicizing E flat.
A large pause before the codetta. Now we really feel it move towards the end.
For a quick overview, we can now go back and take a look. Measure 79 up until around measure 85, roughly the first 7 measures of the restatement of the first subject in the recapitulation, is verbatim restated from the first subject of the exposition. It really departs in the 8th measure of that phrase where the imperfect authentic cadence had originally appeared back at measure 8 into measure 9, now leads to a different modified transitional bridge material at measure 86 in the recapitulation. This transitional bridge material from the original exposition is different in the way that Haydn presents it in the recapitulation. From measure 88, he skips to more modified material borrowed from the exposition's bridge and transition, similar to what we had back around measures 10 and 11 through roughly measures 15 and 16. The first theme was quoted briefly at the third beat of measure 93 before the new transitional material suggests the sense of moving towards the end in the recapitulation rather than what we had back in the exposition. There was a perfect authentic cadence at measure 98 that was sent us to a restatement of the second subject. However, instead of having the second subject in the dominant as it was in the exposition, we can now see that it's tonicized in the tonic key of E flat rather than the dominant here in the recapitulation. This material from measure 98 is similar to what we had back at measure 27 in the exposition. Measure 104's closing theme is similar to what we had back at measure 33 in the second subject of the exposition. But now, of course, it's in E flat instead of the dominant of B flat. This closing theme closely resembles the idea that we saw back at the opening theme of the first subject, but of course now with some modification. The codetta of the recapitulation began at measure 109, which is similar to what we saw back at measure 38 with that half-note figure idea. However, this codetta is 8 measures in length, whereas the first Exposition's codetta was 6 measures in length. Really, that opening half-note figure is the only similarity for the most part that we have here. Haydn takes this codetta towards the end of the movement rather than what we had back at the codetta in the Exposition. Really, it's only that first measure that's similar with the half notes. The material from there onward moves towards the end of the movement for a nice finale of this first movement in the key of E flat.
And that concludes the first movement of Haydn's 52nd Piano Sonata in E flat. Perhaps the most interesting takeaway I took from looking at this first piano sonata was not even in the exposition or the recapitulation at all. It was actually in looking at what he did during the development to foreshadow the beginning of the second movement, which begins strangely in E major. Almost a bit of a Neapolitan feel coming after the E flat that we've been listening to for the first 113 measures. And we see that little hint back during the development at measure 68 when we see Haydn playing with that second subjects theme that we had back around measure 27. But now he's playing with it in the key of E major, which, of course, from the key of E flat, it is close, but it's also very, very far in the way it sounds to our ear. It's a very different tone color, especially considering that he's coming from G minor just previously in the preceding measures of the development. So that's a fairly interesting takeaway I took from looking at this piece. I hope you've enjoyed this review. Well, thank you for watching this. I hope that this was enjoyable for you. This was a lovely piece of music, really remarkable to listen to the dynamic contrast, which was not a focus of this analysis, but the use of the piano was really taking a step forward in this final piano sonata of Haydn. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and see you next time.